What's something about your hometown nobody knows? I'm from a small town where girls who disrespect men get their heads shaved in the town square. I watched it happen to 4 girls in my school before they came for my sister. No evidence needed, just an accusation from any male over 16. The sheriff's son would hold them down while his father ran the Clippers. They called it maintaining order, but really, it just kept girls silent. My sister Anna was valedictorian, headed to Princeton. But when she rejected the mayor's son publicly at prom, saying, "I wouldn't date you if you were the last man alive," everyone knew what was coming. 3 days later, he claimed she'd vandalized his car. No proof, no witnesses, just his word. That's all it took. They announced it over the school intercom. Anna Walton will receive community correction at 3 p.m. today. Community correction. Like she was a typo that needed fixing. Girls weren't allowed to attend. Too emotional, they said. But boys were encouraged to watch, to learn about consequences. My brother Jake was required to be there as the family representative. Mom tried to offer them money, tried to beg, but the mayor just smiled. Rules are rules, unless you want to join her. The town square had a special chair bolted to the platform. They'd painted it pink as some sick joke. The sheriff tested his clippers while the mayor's son stood there grinning, waiting for his revenge. Anna walked out in her Princeton t-shirt, head held high. She'd spent the morning at the salon, getting her hair done perfectly. One last act of defiance. The crowd of men and boys whistled and jeered. They forced her into the chair. The sheriff's son grabbed her head, holding it still. The mayor's son got to make the first cut himself. They called it victim's privilege. He ran the clippers straight down the middle, leaving an ugly strip of bare scalp. The crowd cheered like it was a football game. But as they continued, something shifted. Anna started laughing. Not crying, not breaking. Laughing. "What's so funny?" the sheriff demanded. Anna looked straight at the mayor's son. "I recorded you." The square went silent. "That night you got drunk at Bradley's party, when you admitted what you did to those other girls. Sarah Klein, Jessica Murphy, Amy Rodriguez. You remember, right? When you bragged about..." The mayor's son lunged at her, but Anna kept talking, louder now, addressing the crowd. "He drugged them, all 3, then took photos while they were unconscious. I have the recording. I have the photos he showed people. I sent copies to the state police an hour ago." The sheriff stopped cutting. The mayor's face had gone white. "You're lying," the mayor's son said, but his voice cracked. "Sarah Klein is in the crowd," Anna said. "Sarah, tell them what he did to you." A woman pushed through the crowd, then another, then another. By the time 7 women had stepped forward, the mayor's son was backing away. "Finish the correction," the mayor ordered the sheriff, his voice cold. "Then we deal with these lies." The sheriff looked at the women, at Anna, at his clippers. Then he set them down. "No. I said finish it." "No, not anymore." The mayor grabbed the clippers himself, but when he turned on Anna, she said one more thing that changed everything. "Your wife knows. She's known for years. She's been documenting everything. Every girl you've hurt. Every family you've threatened. She's at the state police station right now." The mayor's phone rang. He listened, his face crumbling. Anna stood up from the chair, her hair half-shaved, looking like a warrior. "You took 4 inches of my hair. The state's going to take 40 years of your lives." But the real revenge wasn't the arrests. It was what the women of the town did next. Every single woman, young, old, married, single, shaved their own heads that night. By morning, you couldn't tell who'd been corrected and who'd chosen it. The mayor and his son were arrested by state police that afternoon. The sheriff resigned. But in the sheriff's house, they found something that made the FBI take over the entire investigation. They found files in the sheriff's basement. Boxes and boxes of them, stacked against the concrete walls like evidence of every crime he never reported. Agent Robbins stood in the town square with her badge clipped to her belt, talking to the state police who'd arrested the mayor and his son 20 minutes ago. Anna sat on the platform steps with her hand pressed against the shaved strip on her head, 7 women forming a protective circle around her. Sarah Klein had her arm around Anna's shoulders. The crowd had mostly cleared out, but about 30 people still stood at the edges watching the police cars. Agent Robbins walked over to us. She looked tired, like she'd been working this case for days instead of just arriving. Mom stood up straighter when the agent approached. Jake stayed next to me, his hands shoved in his pockets. The agent pulled out her badge and showed it to Mom first, then to Anna. Her voice was calm but serious when she spoke, asking if we could come to the state police station for interviews about what happened today. She needed statements from everyone who witnessed the ceremony. Anna nodded without looking up. Mom said yes immediately. Jake just stared at the ground. We drove to the station in separate cars. Mom rode with Anna in one patrol vehicle. Jake and I went in another. The officer driving us didn't say anything the whole 20-minute ride. Jake kept his face turned toward the window. I watched the town pass by, thinking about how different everything looked now compared to 3 hours ago when we'd driven to the square. The state police station smelled like coffee and cleaning chemicals. Detective Valerie White met us in the lobby. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She explained they needed individual statements from each of us, so we'd be separated into different rooms. Mom squeezed Anna's hand before a female officer led Anna down one hallway. Another officer took Mom in a different direction. Detective White gestured for me to follow her. The interview room had gray walls and a table with 2 chairs. A camera mounted in the corner had a red light blinking. Detective White sat across from me and pulled out a notebook. She asked me to describe everything I saw in the square, starting from when we arrived. I told her about the pink chair bolted to the platform, about the crowd of men and boys watching, about the sheriff testing his clippers while the mayor's son waited, about Anna walking out in her Princeton shirt with her hair perfect from the salon. My voice stayed steady when I described the mayor's son making the first cut, the crowd cheering, Anna starting to laugh instead of cry, her words about recording him at the party, the 7 women stepping forward, the sheriff setting down the clippers, the mayor trying to grab them himself, Anna standing up and announcing the mayor's wife was at the police station right now. Detective White wrote everything down without interrupting. When I finished, she asked specific questions about timing, about who said what exactly, about where people were standing. She wanted details about the women who stepped forward. I gave her their names as best I could remember. Sarah Klein, for sure. I thought one was Jessica Murphy, but wasn't certain. The detective thanked me and said someone would type up my statement for me to sign. I sat in the waiting room after that. Jake was still giving his statement. Mom was still in her interview. Anna hadn't come out yet either. The plastic chairs were uncomfortable. A TV mounted on the wall played news with the sound off. I watched the closed captions scroll by, stories about weather and traffic and politics. Nothing about our town yet, but that would change soon. Jake finally emerged from his interview room 40 minutes later. His eyes were red. He sat down next to me without saying anything, just stared at his hands in his lap. His fingers were shaking slightly. I'd never seen Jake look this small before. He was 14, only 2 years younger than me, but right now he looked about 10. I asked if he was okay. The question felt stupid as soon as I said it. Of course he wasn't okay. None of us were okay. Jake didn't answer right away. He kept staring at his hands. Then he started talking, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me about the other ceremonies, 4 of them before Anna's. The sheriff's son had made him watch every single one. Jake said he'd been picked as family representative for the first one because Dad was out of town for work, and I was at college orientation. After that, the sheriff's son kept choosing him. Jake wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but the sheriff's son stood at the exits blocking anyone from leaving. The boys had to watch. Those were the rules. Jake described the first girl, a senior named Michelle. She'd talked back to her stepfather at a family dinner. Someone reported it. Jake watched them shave her head while she cried. The second girl was younger, maybe 13. She'd posted something online about the mayor that someone considered disrespectful. Jake said he had nightmares about her screams. The third and fourth girls blurred together in his memory because he started shutting down emotionally during the ceremonies, just standing there numb while it happened. He told me he felt sick every time they announced another correction over the school intercom. He knew he'd have to go watch, knew he couldn't stop it, knew if he tried to leave or close his eyes, the sheriff's son would notice and report him for disrespect too. Jake said when they announced Anna's name, he almost threw up in the hallway at the school. Agent Robbins appeared in the waiting room doorway and motioned for Detective White to follow her into a side office. The door didn't close all the way. I could hear fragments of their conversation, words like files and photographs and transported, state lines, multiple jurisdictions. Agent Robbins' voice got louder when she said something about the scope being much bigger than they initially thought. Detective White's face went pale. I watched through the partially open door as she grabbed her phone and made a call. She spoke quickly, requesting additional units and evidence techs. She gave addresses, street names I recognized from our town, the sheriff's house, town hall, 2 other locations I couldn't quite hear. Agent Robbins came back out and told us we couldn't go home yet. The FBI needed to secure multiple crime scenes across town. Our house was one of them because the sheriff had been inside several times over the years for various town business. They needed to check for evidence. Mom would need to arrange somewhere else for us to stay tonight. Mom called our aunt who lived 2 towns over. I could hear her voice shaking as she explained the situation. Yes, all 3 kids. Just for tonight. Maybe longer. She didn't know yet. Our aunt must have agreed because Mom thanked her multiple times before hanging up. She told us we'd stay there until the FBI finished processing our house. None of us had brought anything with us. No clothes, no toothbrushes, nothing. We'd left for the square thinking we'd be home in 2 hours. 2 paramedics arrived and asked for Anna. Detective White brought her out of the interview room. Anna looked exhausted, her face drained of color. The paramedics explained they needed to take her to the hospital for medical evaluation. Standard procedure after an assault. The word assault hung in the air. That's what it was legally, even though the town had called it correction. Anna didn't argue. She just nodded and followed them. Mom asked if she could ride along. The paramedics said yes. Detective White told me and Jake to wait here, that someone would drive us to the hospital soon. I watched Anna walk out with the paramedics on either side of her. She still had her hand pressed against the shaved strip on her head. Jake and I sat in the waiting room for another hour. Officers came and went. Phones rang constantly. Someone brought us bottles of water and granola bars from a vending machine. Jake ate his without tasting it. I couldn't eat it all. The news on TV still showed nothing about our town. The closed captions talked about a storm system moving through the state, traffic delays on the interstate, a new school funding bill. Finally, a state trooper appeared and said he'd take us to the hospital. The drive took 15 minutes. Jake stared out the window the whole time. I tried to prepare myself for seeing Anna again, for seeing what the examination would reveal about how rough they'd been with her. The hospital emergency room was busy. A woman with a crying baby sat near the entrance. An old man with a bandaged arm waited by the registration desk. The trooper spoke to someone at the desk, then pointed us toward the elevators. 3rd floor, room 314. Anna had already been moved from the ER to a regular room. Mom met us outside Anna's door. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. Her makeup was smudged from crying. She hugged both of us without saying anything. Then she told us the doctor had found evidence of rough handling on Anna's scalp, bruising where the sheriff's son had gripped her head, small cuts from the clippers being pressed too hard. The doctor was documenting everything for the assault charges. The sheriff's son would face additional charges for the physical harm he caused while holding Anna down. Anna was sitting up in the hospital bed when we walked in. The room was dim, just one lamp on in the corner. The window showed darkness outside now. Hours had passed since the ceremony in the square. Anna's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window glass. She kept touching the shaved strip, running her fingers along the bare scalp. I sat in the chair next to her bed. Jake stood by the door like he wasn't sure if he should come closer. Anna didn't look at us. She just kept staring at her reflection and touching her head. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. She said she knew this would happen, knew they'd come for her after she rejected the mayor's son at prom. She'd spent 3 weeks planning exactly how to turn her public humiliation into their exposure. Anna explained how she'd gotten close to the mayor's son at the school after prom, pretended to reconsider, acted friendly, got herself invited to parties where he'd be drinking. She knew he bragged when he was drunk, knew he'd eventually say something she could record. The party at Bradley's house had been her 4th attempt. The first 3 times he'd been too sober or too surrounded by other people, but the 4th time, he'd gotten drunk enough and isolated enough to start talking about what he'd done to those other girls. She recorded everything on her phone, sent copies to 3 different email accounts in case something happened to her phone, sent the recording and the photos he'd shown people to the state police the morning of her ceremony. She knew the mayor's wife was ready to testify because they'd been communicating through a secret email account for 2 months. Anna had found the mayor's wife through research, through connecting dots between families who'd suddenly left town, through old newspaper articles about girls who'd disappeared. Anna said she knew her carefully planned future was about to get destroyed, knew Princeton would have to wait, knew she'd have trauma to process. But she also knew she couldn't let them keep doing this to other girls, couldn't graduate and escape to college while leaving this system in place for the next girl who rejected the wrong boy. A social worker knocked and came in without waiting for an answer. She introduced herself and explained she was here to discuss ongoing care and support. She sat on the edge of Anna's bed and talked about trauma therapy, about PTSD treatment, about the resources available through victim services. She said Princeton had been contacted and had agreed to a medical deferral of Anna's acceptance. Anna's face crumbled when she heard that. The warrior mask she'd been wearing since the square finally broke. She started crying, really crying, for the first time all day. The social worker handed her tissues and waited. Anna said she'd worked so hard for Princeton. 4 years of perfect grades and activities and applications. She was supposed to start in 6 weeks, supposed to finally get out of this town and build the life she'd planned. The social worker explained gently that trauma doesn't follow anyone's timeline, that Anna would need months of therapy before she'd be ready for the academic and social pressure of an Ivy League school, that trying to push through without proper treatment would likely result in breakdown or failure, that taking time to heal wasn't giving up, it was being realistic about what she needed. Anna nodded, but kept crying. Mom moved to the bed and held her. I looked away, feeling like I was intruding on something private. Jake had tears running down his face, too. The social worker stayed for another 20 minutes, giving Anna information packets and phone numbers and appointment schedules. Then she left, saying she'd check back tomorrow. A crisis counselor appeared an hour later asking for Jake. Mom looked confused. The counselor explained that Jake had mentioned some things during his statement that concerned the detective, things about nightmares and forced witnessing. The counselor wanted to talk to Jake about what he'd experienced at the previous ceremonies. Jake looked terrified. Mom asked if she should come too. The counselor said Jake could decide. Jake shook his head. He wanted to talk alone. They went to a small consultation room down the hall. I stayed with Anna and Mom. Anna had stopped crying but looked emptied out, like she had nothing left inside her. Jake's session lasted 2 hours. When he came back, his eyes were swollen from crying. The counselor walked with him, her hand on his shoulder. She spoke to Mom privately for a few minutes while Jake sat down next to me. He didn't say anything, just sat there staring at nothing. The counselor came over and explained to all of us that being forced to witness violence against others, especially as a minor, constitutes psychological abuse, that Jake would need ongoing treatment for the trauma, that he'd been experiencing symptoms of PTSD, including nightmares, panic attacks, and avoidance behaviors, that the sheriff's son blocking the exits so boys couldn't leave was part of a deliberate pattern to traumatize and control the male youth in town, making them complicit in the abuse of girls. She said Jake wasn't alone, that other boys who'd been forced to watch were also dealing with similar trauma, that Victim Services was setting up support groups specifically for the boys who'd been required to attend ceremonies, that healing would take time but was absolutely possible with proper treatment. Jake nodded like he understood, but his face stayed blank. The counselor gave Mom more paperwork, more phone numbers, more appointment information. She said Jake should start therapy within the next few days, not wait weeks. That early intervention was crucial. Mom promised she'd make the appointments tomorrow. We finally left the hospital near midnight. The trooper who'd brought us drove us to our aunt's house. Anna fell asleep in the car, her head against the window. Jake stared at his phone without really looking at it. Mom held my hand in the back seat, squeezing it too tight. I watched our town pass by in the darkness, wondering if anything would ever feel normal again. Our aunt's house sat dark except for the kitchen light when we pulled into the driveway at midnight. The trooper walked us to the door and waited until our aunt opened it before driving away. Mom went straight to the kitchen, and I heard her voice before I even got inside. She was on the phone, and her tone sounded different from it had all day. Not scared anymore, not desperate, just focused and businesslike. I walked in and saw her sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad, writing things down while she talked. Anna collapsed on the couch without even taking off her shoes. Jake went straight to the bathroom and locked himself in. Our aunt made tea nobody drank and hovered near Mom, listening to the one-sided conversation. Mom was talking about legal protection for our family, about witness security measures, about what happens next in the investigation. She kept saying things like, "I understand," and "that makes sense," and writing more notes. When she finally hung up, she looked at all of us gathered in the kitchen doorway. The lawyer was someone the mayor's wife had been working with for months, she explained. The mayor's wife had been preparing her testimony in secret, building a case, documenting everything. The lawyer specialized in cases involving abuse of power and had been helping her gather evidence that would hold up in court. Mom said the lawyer was now offering to represent our family too, to make sure we were protected from retaliation and that our rights were respected throughout the investigation. Anna asked if we needed a lawyer if we were the victims, and Mom explained that in cases this complicated, with this many powerful people involved, having legal representation meant nobody could pressure us or trick us into saying things that might hurt the case later. The lawyer had already filed paperwork to prevent anyone from contacting us directly without going through her office first. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders, knowing someone was actively working to keep us safe. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications. The news had broken overnight. Every major outlet was running stories about the FBI investigation in our town. I scrolled through headlines about trafficking charges and regional networks and girls being transported across state lines. The sheriff's house had contained files going back 15 years, detailed records of at least 30 victims, evidence of coordination with men in other towns and states. What started as a local corruption case had exploded into something much bigger. Federal prosecutors were taking over because the charges now included conspiracy, civil rights violations, and human trafficking. The articles explained that even though the girls weren't sold for sex, transporting them to other locations where they could be abused by other men met the legal definition of trafficking. The mayor and sheriff weren't just looking at local charges they might have escaped through connections and corruption. They were facing federal prison time measured in decades, not years. I went downstairs and found Mom already awake, reading the same articles on her laptop. She looked exhausted, but also relieved. Federal charges meant the case couldn't be buried or dismissed by local officials with ties to the accused. It meant the investigation would be thorough and professional, handled by people with no stake in protecting our town's reputation. Anna came down an hour later, and Mom showed her the news. Anna read through several articles without saying anything, then closed the laptop and went back upstairs. I followed her and found her sitting on the bed in the guest room, staring at her phone. She'd been tagged in hundreds of social media posts overnight, people from across the country expressing support and sharing her story. She looked overwhelmed by the attention, scrolling through messages without responding to any of them. Sarah Klein called Anna's phone around 10 that morning. I was sitting next to Anna when it rang and saw her hesitate before answering. Sarah's voice came through faint but clear, asking if Anna had seen the news about the support meeting being organized by state victim advocates. Sarah wanted to know if Anna would come, if she felt ready to be in a room with other survivors and hear their stories. Anna bit her lip, and I could see her weighing whether she had the strength for it. Sarah kept talking, saying she understood if it was too soon, but that she was going herself, and it might help to have someone there who understood what she was going through. Anna looked at me and asked if I would come with her for support. She wasn't ready to face a room full of people alone, she said. I nodded immediately. She told Sarah yes, she would be there, and wrote down the address of the community center where the meeting was being held. After she hung up, Anna sat quietly for a few minutes. I asked if she was sure she wanted to go, and she said no, she wasn't sure. But she was going anyway because staying in this bedroom feeling isolated wasn't helping her heal. Mom drove us to the community center that afternoon. The building looked ordinary from outside, just a plain brick structure with a small parking lot. Inside, a woman wearing an advocate badge directed us to a meeting room down the hall. Anna squeezed my hand before walking through the door. I watched her enter a room where 12 other women and girls were already sitting in a circle of chairs. Some faces I recognized from the school and around town. Others I'd never seen before. The advocate leading the meeting welcomed Anna and gestured to an empty chair. She explained to everyone that this was a safe space to share experiences without any pressure to participate in legal proceedings if they weren't ready. She emphasized that healing happened on each person's own timeline and that being here was an act of courage regardless of whether they chose to testify or not. The advocate talked about confidentiality and respect and the importance of listening without judgment. Then she invited anyone who felt comfortable to begin sharing their story. I stayed outside in the hallway, sitting on a bench against the wall. The door wasn't completely soundproof, and I could hear fragments of what was being said inside. A woman's voice described years of harassment from the sheriff, how he would pull her over for no reason and make comments about her body, how she was too afraid to report it because he was the one you were supposed to report things to. Another voice, younger, talked about being shaved in the square 2 years ago after she refused to go on a date with a town council member's son. She described how she left town right after and hadn't been back until now, how she'd been living with relatives 3 states away, trying to forget it ever happened. A third voice mentioned threats against her family, how her father's business had been targeted with inspections and fines after she complained about being groped at a school dance by the mayor's son. The stories kept coming, each one revealing another layer of the system that had been operating in our town for decades. Girls who left suddenly and never came back. Parents who were too scared to speak up because they depended on town officials for their jobs or business permits. Teachers who saw things but stayed silent because they feared retaliation. The scope of what had been happening became clear as I sat there listening to fragments through the door. This wasn't just about a few bad men. It was about an entire structure designed to keep girls silent and compliant, to punish any resistance, to make examples out of anyone who challenged male authority. My stomach turned thinking about how many people must have known something was wrong but chose to look away because speaking up meant becoming the next target. Anna emerged from the meeting 2 hours later, looking completely drained. Her eyes were red, and her shoulders sagged like she'd been carrying something heavy and finally set it down. Sarah Klein walked out right behind her, and they stood in the hallway exchanging phone numbers. Sarah said she would text Anna later to check in, and that if Anna ever needed to talk to someone who understood, she should call any time, day or night. Anna thanked her, and they hugged briefly before Sarah left. Anna and I walked back to the parking lot in silence. Mom was waiting in the car and took one look at Anna's face before starting the engine without asking questions. On the drive back to our aunt's house, Anna stared out the window. I wanted to ask what it was like in there, what stories she'd heard, but I could tell she needed quiet to process everything. When we got back, Anna went straight to the guest room and closed the door. I sat in the kitchen with Mom and our aunt, and Mom asked if I thought Anna was okay. I said I didn't know, but that at least now she knew she wasn't alone in what she'd experienced. Mom nodded and went back to reading emails from the lawyer about next steps in the legal process. The FBI held a press conference the following afternoon. We watched it live on Mom's laptop, all of us gathered around the kitchen table. Agent Robbins stood at a podium with the FBI seal behind her, flanked by other federal agents and state police officials. She announced federal charges against the mayor, sheriff, and mayor's son for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and human trafficking. Her voice was steady and professional as she explained that the sheriff's house had contained files documenting at least 30 victims over 15 years. The files included photographs, personal information, and detailed notes about which girls might be vulnerable to coercion or threats. Even more disturbing, the evidence showed some victims had been transported to other states where they were abused by men the sheriff and mayor had connections with. Agent Robbins said the investigation was ongoing and they expected to identify additional victims and potentially additional perpetrators as they worked through all the evidence. She emphasized that anyone with information should contact the FBI tip line and that victim advocates were available to provide support to anyone affected. The press conference lasted 30 minutes and included questions from reporters about how such systematic abuse could go undetected for so long. Agent Robbins explained that the men involved held positions of authority that allowed them to silence complaints and intimidate potential witnesses. She said this case highlighted the importance of independent oversight and the need for victims to have access to reporting mechanisms outside local control. When the press conference ended, Anna closed the laptop and said she felt sick, knowing those files existed, that the sheriff had been documenting and tracking girls like they were inventory. Our town exploded on social media within hours. The story went national and then international. News outlets across the country picked it up, running segments about the small town where girls were publicly humiliated for disobeying men. Reporters descended on our street and camped outside our aunt's house trying to get interviews with Anna. They knocked on the door repeatedly despite our aunt telling them to leave. They called our phones using numbers they'd somehow obtained. They approached us in parking lots and outside stores. Mom finally called the lawyer who sent a formal statement to all media outlets saying our family would not be giving interviews and requesting privacy. The lawyer also filed paperwork with local police to prevent reporters from trespassing on our aunt's property. Despite this, the camera crews remained parked on the street, filming the house from public property and waiting for any glimpse of Anna. The attention felt suffocating. We couldn't leave the house without being followed. Our phones buzzed constantly with messages from reporters and strangers. Anna's social media accounts were flooded with thousands of comments, both supportive and hateful. Some people called her brave and a hero. Others called her a liar who destroyed innocent men's lives for attention. The hate messages were vicious, accusing Anna of making everything up, saying she deserved what happened to her, threatening violence against our family. Mom had to help Anna lock down all her accounts and set them to private, but screenshots of her posts were already circulating everywhere. The mayor's wife gave an interview to a state newspaper that published 2 days after the FBI press conference. I read it online, stunned by what she revealed. She explained that she'd spent years documenting her husband's crimes because she was terrified of him, but couldn't stay silent anymore after watching Anna's courage in the square. She described living in fear for over 2 decades, knowing what her husband was capable of, but feeling trapped with no way out. She said she started keeping records about 5 years ago when she realized her sons were beginning to follow their father's pattern of behavior. She couldn't stop her husband, but she thought maybe she could at least document what was happening so that someday, somehow, there might be justice. She kept boxes of evidence in a storage unit her husband didn't know about. Photographs of girls before and after their public shamings, copies of complaints that were never properly filed or investigated, recordings of her husband and the sheriff discussing which families to target next, journal entries detailing incidents she witnessed or heard about. financial records showing payments made to families in exchange for their silence. She said Anna's plan to expose everything gave her the courage to finally turn over her evidence to authorities. She knew her husband would never forgive her, that her life as she knew it was over, but she couldn't watch another girl get destroyed while she did nothing. The revelation that she had boxes of evidence dating back 20 years stunned everyone. It meant the abuse and corruption had been even more systematic and long-running than anyone realized. It meant there were likely many more victims than the 30 already identified. It meant the investigation would continue expanding as authorities worked through decades of documentation. Anna finally told me the full story of her investigation late one night when neither of us could sleep. We sat in the dark guest room and she talked for over an hour, explaining everything she'd kept secret for months. She said she started researching after watching the fourth girl get shaved in the square, a freshman named Rebecca, who'd reported being groped by a senior boy at a football game. Anna had known Rebecca from debate club and watched her walk into that square terrified and alone. Something broke inside Anna that day, she said. She couldn't keep watching girls get destroyed while everyone pretended it was normal and acceptable. She started digging into the history of the so-called tradition, looking for any documentation of when it started and who authorized it. She found nothing official because it had never been a real law or ordinance, just something the men in power decided to do, and everyone else went along without a fear. She started paying attention to patterns, noticing which families got targeted and which ones never did. She realized the sheriff and mayor were selecting victims strategically, choosing girls whose families had limited resources or social standing, girls who would be easiest to silence and intimidate. Anna connected with the mayor's wife through a secret email account after noticing her at one of the ceremonies looking distressed. She took a chance sending a carefully worded message, asking if the mayor's wife ever wanted to talk to someone who saw what was really happening. The mayor's wife responded weeks later, and they began communicating in secret. The mayor's wife sharing information, and Anna helping her understand how to document everything properly so it would be admissible as evidence. Anna deliberately got close to the mayor's son at the school, pretending to be interested in him, positioning herself to be invited to parties where he felt comfortable and let his guard down. She waited months for the right opportunity, and when it finally came at that party where he got drunk and started bragging, she recorded everything on her phone hidden in her jacket pocket. She knew rejecting him at prom would trigger retaliation, knew they would come for her with the forced shaving. She planned it that way, she admitted. She wanted to be in that chair in that square when she revealed what she knew, wanted the whole town watching when she exposed them. I sat there listening to her describe months of calculated planning and investigation, work she did entirely alone while maintaining perfect grades and pretending everything was normal. I felt awed by her courage and intelligence and furious that she'd carried this burden without telling anyone, without asking for help or support. She said she couldn't tell anyone because any leak would have ruined everything, given them time to destroy evidence or threaten witnesses. She said she knew the risk she was taking, knew they might hurt her or our family, but she also knew that if she didn't do something, the abuse would continue forever and more girls would suffer. She said she was sorry for putting us all in danger, but she wasn't sorry for what she did. I told Anna I understood why she did what she did, but I needed time to process that she'd put herself in danger without letting anyone help her. She nodded, and we sat in silence for a while before she finally fell asleep. The next morning, Mom drove Jake to his first appointment with the trauma specialist the victim services people recommended. Her name was Kathleen Joyce, and she worked out of an office 2 towns over because our town didn't have anyone qualified to handle this kind of case. Jake was nervous about going, kept saying he didn't need therapy because he wasn't the one who got hurt. Mom told him that watching violence happen to people you care about counts as trauma too, and he needed to talk to someone who understood that. I stayed home with Anna while they were gone, and we spent most of the morning just existing in the same space without talking much. She seemed tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Around noon, the house phone rang, and Mom's voice came through the answering machine, asking me to turn on the local news channel. I grabbed the remote and switched it on, and there was the defense attorney for the mayor's son standing in front of the courthouse giving a statement to reporters. His name was Donald Carlson, and he had this smooth way of talking that made everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. He claimed the town tradition was actually a form of consensual community discipline that families had agreed to participate in for generations. He called it a cultural practice that outside authorities didn't understand, said the forced head-shaving ceremonies were no different from other communities having their own ways of handling misbehavior. He made it sound like Anna and the other victims had somehow volunteered for public humiliation, like their families had signed up for this treatment. Anna stood up from the couch so fast she knocked over her water glass. She grabbed her phone and started typing furiously, her face red with anger. Within minutes, her social media was flooded with responses from other victims and their supporters, all of them furious at how Carlson was trying to rewrite what actually happened. Sarah Klein posted a long statement describing exactly how she'd been drugged and assaulted, then forced into that chair while men cheered. Other women shared their own stories, making it clear there was nothing consensual about any of it. The phone started ringing constantly with reporters wanting Anna's response to the defense attorney's claims. Mom had told us not to talk to media without the lawyer present, so we let everything go to voicemail. By late afternoon, the story had spread across the state, and women who'd never been to our town were posting angry responses about Carlson's attempt to normalize abuse by calling it culture. Jake and Mom got home around 5, and Jake looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. Mom said his first session had lasted over 3 hours because he had so much to process. He went straight to his room without eating dinner, and Mom didn't push him to talk about it. She just said Kathleen Joyce was excellent at her job, and Jake would be seeing her twice a week for the foreseeable future. The next day, a thick envelope arrived from Princeton with Anna's name on it. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, like she was afraid of what might be inside. When she finally tore it open, she pulled out her official acceptance letter, along with a personal note from the Dean of Admissions. The note said the university had been following the news about what happened in our town, and they wanted Anna to know her place at Princeton was secure. They were offering to hold her spot for up to 2 years, while she dealt with the aftermath of her bravery, and they'd work with her on whatever timeline she needed for enrollment. Anna read the note 3 times, then started crying. Not the angry crying from when she watched Carlson's interview, but this deep, relieved crying that came from somewhere she'd been holding tension for months. She told me she'd been terrified that exposing the mayor's son would somehow cost her Princeton, that the university would see her as damaged or problematic and rescind her acceptance. Having that fear lifted made her realize how much weight she'd been carrying about her future being destroyed. But even with the relief, she was also grieving the loss of leaving for college in a few months, like she'd planned. Her escape from this town was supposed to happen in September, and now that timeline was completely uncertain. That same week, national media crews started showing up in town. I'd see their vans parked in the square with satellite dishes on top, reporters doing stand-ups with the pink chair visible behind them. They'd brought in lights and equipment, turning our town square into a television studio. I walked past one afternoon and heard a reporter describing our town's tradition of public head shaving to a camera, explaining how young women were held down and humiliated for supposedly disrespecting men. It was surreal hearing our normal described as shocking to people who didn't grow up here. Part of me felt deep shame that this was my hometown, the place where I'd lived my whole life, and somehow thought this was just how things were. But another part of me felt relieved that outside eyes were finally seeing what we'd normalized, because it meant this could never happen again, without the whole country watching. The town council called an emergency meeting to discuss the crisis, and Mom insisted we all attend to show support for the victims. The meeting room was packed with people standing along the walls because there weren't enough seats. The council members looked uncomfortable as they tried to start the meeting, but before they could even finish the opening statements, people started shouting. Some residents stood up demanding the council issue a formal apology to all the victims and remove the pink chair from the square immediately. Others, including a council member named Kevin Branson, started yelling that the arrests were government overreach and the town was destroyed by outsiders who didn't understand local traditions. Branson claimed the mayor and sheriff were innocent men whose lives were being ruined over political correctness. The shouting got louder and angrier, with people on both sides refusing to listen to each other. Someone called the mayor's son a hero for standing up to feminist pressure. Someone else called Branson a rape apologist. The council president tried to restore order, but nobody was listening anymore. After an hour of chaos, the council took a vote on whether to issue an apology and remove the chair, and the vote split exactly down the middle with no resolution. The meeting ended with nothing accomplished, except making it clear our town was divided into 2 camps that couldn't even agree on basic facts about what had happened. Mom left that meeting looking tired and frustrated, but the next day she told us she'd found a parent support group for families of victims. She'd connected with 3 other mothers whose daughters had been through the forced ceremonies in previous years, and all of them had tried to report what happened, but were threatened into silence by the sheriff. One mother said the sheriff came to her house and told her that if she filed a complaint, her husband would lose his job at the county office. Another said the mayor personally called her and suggested her family might want to consider moving to another town if they couldn't accept community standards. The mothers had been carrying guilt for years about not protecting their daughters, and now they were working together to document all the threats and intimidation they'd experienced. Their stories were going to be crucial evidence for the federal conspiracy charges because they showed a pattern of officials working together to silence anyone who tried to stop the abuse. Anna spent several days agonizing over what to do about her hair before finally deciding to cut the rest of it into a short pixie style instead of trying to grow out the shaved strip. She said she was tired of looking in the mirror and seeing the half-finished humiliation the mayor's son had started. She wanted to take control of her own appearance instead of letting his violence define how she looked. She went to a salon in the next town over where nobody knew her story, and the stylist gave her a cute shortcut that actually looked intentional and stylish. When she got home, she took a photo and posted it on social media with the caption, "Taking back my own narrative," and within hours, she had thousands of supportive comments from women around the world. Some shared their own stories of cutting their hair after trauma, others just sent encouragement and love. The post went viral, and suddenly Anna's face was everywhere online, representing something bigger than just our town's specific horror. Meanwhile, Sarah Klein decided to give her first interview to a journalist named Adriana Reed, who worked for the state newspaper. Reed had been covering the story since the arrests and had a reputation for handling sensitive topics with care. Sarah sat down with her for 3 hours and described in detail what the mayor's son did to her 2 years ago at a party. She talked about waking up confused and sick, finding photos on her phone she didn't remember taking, realizing she'd been drugged and violated while unconscious. Then she described being accused of public drunkenness a week later and forced into that pink chair while the mayor's son watched and smiled. She said the head shaving made her feel erased as a person, like they were trying to physically remove her from existence because she'd become inconvenient after he assaulted her. Reed's article was published that weekend, and it was devastating to read. Sarah's testimony helped people understand this was never about discipline or tradition. It was about power and control and silencing victims of sexual violence. The article got picked up by national outlets, and suddenly everyone was talking about the connection between the assault and the public humiliation that followed. When I finally went back to the school the following Monday, I knew it was going to be rough, but I wasn't prepared for how divided everything had become. Some students came up to me immediately and said Anna was a hero, that she'd done something brave that would protect other girls. But others, mostly kids whose families were connected to the mayor or sheriff or their supporters, treated me like I was a traitor. In my third period class, a guy I'd been friends with since middle school started loudly talking about how Anna had ruined the town's reputation over a harmless tradition. He said she was an attention seeker who wanted to be famous and didn't care about destroying innocent people's lives. I tried to ignore him, but he kept going, saying the mayor's son was railroaded by feminists who hated men. I finally turned around and told him there was nothing harmless about holding girls down and shaving their heads in public, nothing innocent about drugging and assaulting them first. He called me brainwashed and said I was choosing my sister over the truth. We ended up in a screaming match that got us both sent to the principal's office. That afternoon, the FBI held another press conference, and Agent Robbins announced they were expanding the investigation to 3 neighboring towns. The sheriff's files had references to corrections performed in other places, suggesting the network of abuse was bigger than anyone initially thought. Robbins said they'd already identified at least 15 additional victims in the surrounding area who'd never been reported to any authorities. She explained that the trafficking charges were expanding because evidence showed girls were being transported between towns for these ceremonies, creating a regional system of abuse that crossed state lines. The investigation that started with Anna's recording in our town square had grown into something massive that would take months or maybe years to fully uncover. Anna came home from her first session with Kathleen Joyce looking completely wiped out. She walked past me without saying anything and went straight to her room. I waited an hour before knocking on her door. She was sitting on her bed, staring at nothing. I asked if she wanted to talk about it. She said therapy was way harder than she expected because Kathleen wouldn't let her stay in warrior mode. All those months planning the takedown, Anna had pushed aside every scared feeling and every moment of violation to focus on execution. Now Kathleen was making her actually feel all of it. She told me she spent 40 minutes just crying in Kathleen's office, not even talking, just letting herself break down in a way she couldn't afford to do before the arrests. She said the worst part was Kathleen asking her to describe how it felt when the mayor's son made that first cut down her scalp. Anna had trained herself not to think about that moment, to skip past it to the victory that came after. But Kathleen kept bringing her back to it, making her sit with the fear and humiliation she'd buried. Anna looked at me with red eyes and said she didn't know if she could keep doing this every week. I told her she was the bravest person I knew, and if she could face down the mayor in that square, she could face this too. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. The next week, something disturbing started happening around town. People began wearing pink ribbons pinned to their shirts and jackets. At first, I didn't understand what it meant. Then I saw Kevin Branson standing outside the courthouse with a group of about 20 people, all wearing the ribbons, holding signs that said, "Innocent until proven guilty," and "Stop the witch hunt." They were showing support for the arrested men. They actually thought the mayor and his son were victims of some conspiracy. Kevin had set up a legal defense fund and was collecting donations in a jar at the grocery store. The jar had a photo of the mayor's family from before the arrests, trying to make people feel sorry for them. Within a week, Kevin announced they'd raised $30,000. $30,000 for the defense of men who drugged girls and forced public humiliation ceremonies. I couldn't believe how divided our town had become. Half the people thought Anna was a hero. The other half thought she'd destroyed innocent lives for attention. I got into another fight at the school with a guy whose dad donated $500 to the defense fund. He told me Anna should be the one arrested for false accusations. I asked him if he thought all 40 victims were lying. He said the FBI probably coached them all to tell the same story. There was no reasoning with these people. Mom started getting phone calls at night. The first one came around 11 p.m. A man's voice told her to make Anna take back her testimony, or there would be consequences. Mom hung up and immediately called the FBI. Agent Robbins told her to report every call and keep a log of the times and what was said. The calls kept coming, sometimes twice a night, different voices, but always the same message. Make Anna recant. Say it was all a misunderstanding. Admit she made it up for attention. Mom recorded the calls on her phone and sent the files to Agent Robbins after each one. The FBI traced the numbers and found they belonged to relatives of the mayor's son, his uncle, his cousin, his grandfather. They added witness intimidation charges to the growing list of federal crimes. The calls stopped after the FBI showed up at those relatives' houses with arrest warrants. But the damage was done. Mom barely slept anymore. She kept checking the locks on all the doors and windows. She made Jake and me promise not to walk anywhere alone. The fear the mayor had used to control this town for years wasn't gone just because he was in custody. It had spread to his supporters who wanted revenge for his arrest. Jessica Murphy and Amy Rodriguez finally came forward with detailed statements to the prosecutors. I knew their names from Anna's recording, but they'd stayed quiet during the initial investigation. Now, they were ready to talk. Jessica went first, meeting with prosecutors for 6 hours at the county courthouse. She described being at a party 2 years ago where the mayor's son offered her a drink. She remembered feeling dizzy and confused. She woke up hours later in a bedroom she didn't recognize with her clothes disheveled and photos on her phone she didn't remember taking. Photos of her unconscious. Photos the mayor's son had taken while assaulting her. She tried to report it to the sheriff, but he told her she was just drunk and making accusations she'd regret. 2 weeks later, the mayor's son accused her of stealing from his car. No proof, no witnesses, just his word. They brought her to the square and shaved her head while he watched and smiled. Amy's story was almost identical. Different party, same pattern. Drugged, assaulted, photographed. Then accused of vandalism a week later and publicly humiliated. Both their accounts matched Anna's recording exactly, down to specific details about the photos and the threats. The prosecutors now had corroborating evidence from multiple victims describing the same predatory pattern. The mayor's son couldn't claim it was a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake. This was systematic abuse carried out over years. Anna got a letter from Princeton. She opened it at the kitchen table with her hands shaking. I thought maybe they were rescinding her acceptance after all the media attention. But the letter said they weren't just holding her place. They were offering her a full scholarship that covered tuition, housing, therapy costs, and living expenses for whenever she was ready to attend. The dean of admissions had written a personal note saying Anna's courage in exposing abuse made her exactly the kind of student Princeton wanted to support. The university had a fund specifically for students who'd experienced trauma, and they wanted Anna to know she'd have comprehensive support services available. Anna cried reading the letter, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was relief. For months, she'd worried that speaking up would cost her the future she'd worked so hard to build, but Princeton was telling her the opposite. They valued her more because she'd chosen to do the right thing even when it cost her something. She kept rereading the dean's note like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Mom made copies of the letter and put one in a frame on the mantel. She said she wanted a reminder that good things could still happen even when everything felt dark. I watched Anna video chat with Princeton's dean of students a few days later. She'd set up her laptop in the living room, and I sat on the couch nearby. The dean was a woman named Dr. Walton, no relation, who ran the university's student wellness programs. She asked Anna how she was doing and actually waited for a real answer instead of accepting a polite deflection. Anna admitted she was struggling. She had nightmares most nights. Crowds made her anxious. She was working with a therapist, but processing trauma took time. Dr. Walton said they could discuss her starting in the spring semester instead of fall. That would give Anna 6 more months to stabilize before taking on the pressure of classes. Anna looked torn. Part of her wanted to escape this town immediately, to get as far away as possible from the pink ribbons and the threatening phone calls and the daily reminders of what happened. But another part of her knew she wasn't emotionally ready to handle an Ivy League school while still processing everything. She asked Dr. Walton what would happen to her scholarship if she deferred. Dr. Walton promised the full package would remain available whenever Anna decided to start. There was no pressure, no deadline. Anna could take the time she needed. After the call ended, Anna sat staring at her laptop screen. She told me she'd spent years planning for Princeton, and now that she had the chance to go, she wasn't sure she was strong enough to take it. I reminded her that strength wasn't about never being scared. It was about doing hard things even when you were terrified. She'd already proven she had that kind of strength in the town square. The preliminary hearing for federal charges started 3 weeks later. Our whole family went to the courthouse to support Anna and the other victims who were testifying. The courtroom was packed with people from town, split between those supporting the victims and those wearing pink ribbons for the accused. Defense attorney Donald Carlson stood up first and argued that the community correction tradition was a protected cultural practice. He claimed the town had been performing these ceremonies for generations as a form of restorative justice agreed upon by families. He said the federal government had no right to interfere with local customs that didn't violate any laws. Federal prosecutor Garrett Osborne stood up and systematically destroyed his argument. He cited civil rights law precedents going back decades. He explained that forced public humiliation based on gender was a clear violation of constitutional protections. He presented evidence that victims never consented and their families were threatened into compliance. He showed the judge documentation of the drugging and assault that preceded many of the ceremonies, proving this wasn't about discipline, but about silencing victims of sexual violence. He argued that transporting victims across state lines made this federal trafficking regardless of any claimed cultural tradition. Carlson tried to interrupt several times, but the judge told him to sit down. By the end of Osborne's presentation, even the pink ribbon supporters looked uncomfortable. The judge took a brief recess and came back with her ruling. She said there was sufficient evidence for all charges to proceed to trial. Carlson's motion to dismiss was denied. During the break, I went outside for air and found myself standing next to an older man who introduced himself as Ralph Osborne. He was Garrett's father, a retired judge who'd come to watch the hearing. He asked if I was Anna's brother, and when I said yes, he told me my sister was incredibly brave. He explained that this case could set important precedent for prosecuting gender-based violence disguised as cultural or religious tradition. He said there were communities across the country that used religion or tradition to justify abuse, and successful prosecution here could help victims in those places find justice too. He talked about cases he'd seen during his career where women and girls suffered for years because authorities were afraid to interfere with claimed cultural practices. He said Anna's willingness to expose the truth publicly, even at personal cost, had triggered something much bigger than our small town. Federal prosecutors around the country were watching this case to see how the courts would handle the intersection of civil rights and claimed cultural protection. If the prosecution succeeded here, it would make it easier to bring similar cases elsewhere. I'd been so focused on what happened to Anna and our family that I hadn't thought about the broader implications. Ralph told me to make sure Anna knew her courage was protecting people she'd never meet in places she'd never been. That knowledge might help during the hard days of recovery. The mayor's wife took the stand the next day. Her testimony lasted 6 hours. She brought 2 decades of documentation, including photographs, journal entries, and recordings of her husband discussing which families to target next. She described watching her husband select victims based on which girls had rejected his son or challenged male authority in town. She presented evidence that he'd been performing these ceremonies since before she married him, that it was a system of control passed down from his father. She played recordings of him coaching his son on how to identify vulnerable targets and how to make accusations that would be believed without proof. Her testimony was devastating. She described knowing about the abuse but staying silent for years because she was terrified of her husband. He'd threatened to have her committed to a psychiatric facility if she ever spoke up. He'd isolated her from her family and monitored her every move. She'd started secretly documenting everything 5 years ago after watching a 14-year-old girl get shaved in the square. She knew she had to gather enough evidence to take him down completely, or he'd destroy her for trying. She'd been working with a lawyer for months before Anna's exposure in the square, preparing to go to authorities. Anna's actions had accelerated her timeline, but she was ready. The prosecutors asked her about her son's behavior. She cried, describing how the mayor had trained their son to view women as property that needed correction. She said she'd tried to protect him from his father's influence, but failed. By the time she realized how damaged he'd become, he was already assaulting girls and bragging about it. She'd wanted to report him too, but knew her husband would cover it up. The mayor's wife made clear that her son had learned his predatory behavior from watching his father operate with impunity for years. Anna had been sitting in the courtroom listening to the testimony with an expression I couldn't read. But when the mayor's wife described knowing about the abuse for years and staying silent out of fear, Anna's face crumbled. She stood up suddenly and walked out. I followed her to the bathroom where she was leaning against the sink trying to breathe. She kept saying she didn't understand how someone could know and do nothing, how the mayor's wife could watch girls get hurt and just document it instead of stopping it. I tried to explain that the woman was trapped too, that she was gathering evidence because she knew a failed attempt to stop it would make things worse. But Anna couldn't hear it. She felt betrayed by the idea that an adult had witnessed years of abuse and prioritized her own safety over protecting victims. I called Kathleen Joyce, who agreed to meet us at her office immediately. Anna spent 2 hours with Kathleen processing her complicated feelings about a woman who was both complicit and trapped, neither pure victim nor simple villain. When Anna came out, she looked exhausted, but calmer. She told me Kathleen had helped her understand that people can be multiple things at once, that the mayor's wife's failure to act sooner didn't erase the courage it took to finally come forward, and that Anna's anger at her was valid, even while acknowledging the fear that kept her silent. The world wasn't as simple as heroes and villains. Most people existed in the complicated space between. Jake's next therapy session happened 3 days after the hearing ended. I drove him there because Mom was at another meeting with the lawyers, and Anna was too exhausted to leave the house. He sat in the passenger seat picking at his thumbnail until it bled, not saying anything the whole drive. When we got to the office, he asked me to come in with him. I'd never been in one of his sessions before, but Kathleen said it was okay if Jake wanted me there. He sat on the couch and stared at his hands for a long time before he started talking. He told Kathleen about last Tuesday at the school, when Mr. Klein raised his voice at a student who forgot their homework. The teacher wasn't even that loud, just frustrated and kind of sharp. But Jake said his heart started racing, so fast he thought he was dying. His hands went numb, and he couldn't breathe right. He ran out of the classroom and hid in the bathroom for 20 minutes trying to calm down. The school counselor found him and called Mom, but Jake didn't know how to explain what happened. Kathleen wrote something in her notes and asked Jake if this happens often. He nodded and said it's been happening since the first ceremony he had to witness 2 years ago. Anytime he hears men yelling or even talking loud in an angry way, his body reacts like he's back in that square watching the sheriff's son hold down a girl while men cheered. She explained that what he's experiencing are panic attacks, a trauma response to being forced to witness violence against people he knew. His brain learned to associate loud male voices with danger and humiliation, so now it triggers his fight or flight response even in safe situations. She recommended he continue therapy twice a week instead of once, and said we should talk to a doctor about medication that might help with the anxiety while he works through the trauma. Jake looked at me when she said that, scared I'd think he was weak for needing pills. I told him there's nothing weak about getting help for something that happened to him, not something he did wrong. On the drive home, he was quiet again, but different, less tense. He said it helped knowing there's a name for what's happening to him, and that it's not his fault his body reacts this way. The FBI called Mom the next morning asking us to come to their field office for an update on the investigation. Agent Robbins met us in a conference room with another agent I didn't recognize and a woman from Victim Services. She opened a folder and pulled out photographs of 7 girls, some I recognized from the school, and some I didn't. She explained that the evidence found in the sheriff's house included detailed records of these girls being transported across state lines over the past 4 years. The sheriff had driven them to locations in 3 different states, where they met with men who had similar authority positions in their own towns. None of the girls were sold for sex in the traditional trafficking sense, but the transportation was part of a network where men in power shared access to vulnerable girls they'd already hurt locally. The legal definition of trafficking includes transportation for exploitation, even without money changing hands. Agent Robbins said the network operated like a trading system where these men could abuse girls from other towns without risking exposure in their own communities. The sheriff kept logs of every trip, including dates, locations, and which girls went where. Some entries included notes about the girls' behavior or whether they'd told anyone afterward. Reading those notes made me sick because they talked about teenage girls like they were objects being rated and reviewed. One entry about a 15-year-old said she cried too much and probably shouldn't be used again. The agent explained they'd already contacted law enforcement in the other states and begun the process of identifying and interviewing the additional victims. This was no longer just about our town or even our county. It was a federal case involving multiple jurisdictions and potentially dozens of perpetrators. Mom asked how the girls were doing, and the victim services woman said they were working with local advocates in each area to provide support and therapy. Some of the families didn't even know their daughters had been taken across state lines because the sheriff told them it was for a special program or opportunity. The parents trusted him because of his position. Agent Robbins said the transportation records would be key evidence in proving the scope of the conspiracy and showing this wasn't just isolated incidents, but an organized system of abuse. Anna made her decision about Princeton 2 days later. I found her in her room staring at the acceptance letter she'd pinned to her bulletin board months ago when everything was different. She'd been trying to convince herself she could start in the fall, that she'd be healed enough by then to handle the pressure of an Ivy League school. But Kathleen had been gently pushing back in their sessions, asking Anna to really think about what she'd be taking on while still processing fresh trauma. Anna sat on her bed and told me she was going to defer for a full year, not because she was giving up on her future, but because she finally understood that trauma recovery can't be rushed, no matter how strong she wants to be. She said Kathleen helped her see that going to Princeton while she's still having nightmares and panic attacks would just set her up to fail. She needs time to actually heal, not just push through and pretend she's okay. I asked if she was scared Princeton would change their mind or give away her spot. She shook her head and showed me an email from the dean of admissions saying they fully supported her decision and her place was secure for whenever she was ready. They even offered to connect her with their counseling services now, so she'd have support in place when she did start. Anna cried reading that email because it felt like someone actually understood that being brave doesn't mean being unbreakable. She told me she spent months planning how to expose the mayor's son and his father, staying focused on that goal instead of processing what was happening to her. Now that they're arrested and the investigation is moving forward, she can't ignore her own pain anymore. She needs this year to figure out who she is after everything that happened, not just jump straight into being a Princeton student like nothing changed. I found out about Jake's secret the following week completely by accident. I was cleaning out the garage looking for old baseball equipment when I found a box shoved behind some paint cans with Jake's name on it. Inside were programs from 4 different ceremonies, the kind they handed out at the town square events, like they were school plays instead of public humiliation. Each program had a girl's name, the accusation against her, and the date of her correction. I recognized 3 of the names from the school. The 4th girl had moved away right after her ceremony, and I'd never known why. Under the programs were notes in Jake's handwriting, dates and times written over and over like he was trying to memorize them, or maybe trying to make sense of them. I brought the box inside and waited for Jake to get home from the school. When he walked in and saw the box on the kitchen table, his face went white. I asked him why he kept these, and he started crying, really crying in a way I hadn't seen since he was little. He told me he didn't just witness those ceremonies because he was required to as a male family member. The sheriff's son had threatened him after the first one, said if Jake ever refused to attend or told anyone what really happened at these events, they'd target our whole family. They'd find a reason to correct Anna, or even Mom. So Jake went to every single ceremony for 2 years, standing there watching girls he knew get their heads shaved while men cheered, carrying this terror alone because he thought he was protecting us. He said he kept the programs because he wanted to remember their names, to honor them somehow since he couldn't help them. Each time he had to witness another ceremony, he felt like he was betraying those girls by not stopping it. The guilt was eating him alive, and he couldn't tell anyone because the threat against our family felt so real. I sat there looking at my younger brother, who'd been carrying this weight for 2 years while I was completely oblivious. I felt terrible for not noticing his fear, for not seeing the signs that something was destroying him from the inside. He said the worst part was when they came for Anna, and he had to stand there again, this time watching his own sister get hurt while pretending to be the family representative like he supported what was happening. That's what finally broke something in him, what made the panic attacks start happening more often. The fundraiser happened that Saturday at the community center. A group of about 30 women who'd shaved their heads in solidarity with Anna organized the whole thing in less than a week. They set up tables with baked goods, craft items, and information about victim services. They hung photos of all the women who'd experienced ceremonies over the years, creating a wall of faces that showed the scope of what had been happening. Local businesses donated items for a silent auction, and people from surrounding towns showed up to support the cause. By noon, the parking lot was full, and people were lined up outside waiting to get in. I volunteered to help at the donation table and watched person after person come through with cash and checks, some giving $20 and some giving hundreds. An older woman I didn't recognize handed me $500 and said her daughter had left town 10 years ago after being accused of disrespecting a teacher. She never knew about the ceremony until this story broke, and her daughter finally told her what really happened. She said this money was for all the girls her daughter's age who suffered in silence because their families didn't know how to help them. By the end of the day, they'd raised $50,000, way more than anyone expected. The organizers announced the money would go toward therapy costs for victims and their families, legal support for those participating in the prosecution and education programs about recognizing and reporting abuse. Anna showed up near the end, and people surrounded her, thanking her for her courage and telling her their own stories. She looked overwhelmed, but also less alone than she'd been in weeks. Sarah Klein was there too, and they stood together looking at the wall of photos, two survivors among many who were finally being seen and believed. The fundraiser showed that despite all the vocal opposition and the people defending the accused men, plenty of community members genuinely wanted to help with healing. The plea deal negotiations started the following Tuesday. Prosecutor Osborne called Mom to let her know the mayor's son's defense team had reached out about a possible agreement. They were offering to have their client plead guilty to some charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Osborne told Mom he'd already rejected their first offer of 10 years because it was insulting given the number of victims and the severity of the crimes. The defense attorney called back with a new proposal of 15 years, and Osborne said no again. He told them he wouldn't accept anything less than 25 years in federal prison, which would mean the mayor's son would be nearly 50 before he got out. The defense attorney tried arguing that his client was young and had been following his father's example, that he deserved some leniency because he was raised in an environment that taught him this behavior was acceptable. But Osborne said the evidence showed clear predatory planning, not just learned behavior. The recordings Anna made proved the mayor's son knew exactly what he was doing and bragged about it. He'd drugged 3 girls and taken photos while they were unconscious, then used those photos to threaten them into silence. That wasn't following his father's example. That was calculated assault. The multiple victims and the evidence of him enjoying their fear undermined any argument about him just being a product of his environment. Osborne told Mom he was prepared to take this to trial if the defense wouldn't agree to a reasonable sentence. He said juries tend to be sympathetic to young defendants, but the evidence in this case was so strong he wasn't worried about getting a conviction. The defense team asked for time to discuss with their client and his family. Mom asked Osborne what he thought would happen, and he said most likely they'd come back with something closer to his number once they realized he was serious about going to trial. Anna got a letter in the mail 3 days later from an address in another state. The envelope had no return address label, just a handwritten name I didn't recognize. Anna opened it at the kitchen table and started reading, her expression changing as she got further into it. When she finished, she handed it to me without saying anything. The letter was from a woman named Rachel, who'd experienced something similar in her religious community when she was 17. The elders had forced her to stand in front of the congregation while they cut off her hair as punishment for questioning church doctrine. She'd never reported it because she thought no one would believe her or care. But when she saw Anna's story on the news, something shifted. She realized what happened to her was wrong, and she didn't have to carry the shame alone anymore. She'd gone to the police in her state and filed a report. They were now investigating her church's practices, and she'd connected with other women who'd experienced similar treatment. Rachel wrote that she knew her letter couldn't make Anna's trauma easier to carry, but she wanted Anna to know her courage in exposing the abuse had given others permission to speak up too. Anna's pain was serving a purpose beyond our town, creating ripples that reached people she'd never meet. Anna folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She told me it helped knowing something good was coming from what happened to her, but it also made her sad that so many other girls and women had experienced this kind of treatment. The letter reminded her she wasn't alone in this. That public humiliation as a tool of control happened in lots of places, not just our town. She said she might write back to Rachel when she felt ready. Maybe they could support each other through their healing. The FBI held another press conference the next week, announcing major developments in the expanded investigation. Agent Robbins stood at a podium with officials from 3 other states and explained they'd identified 12 additional victims in neighboring towns. The total number of women and girls victimized by the network had grown to over 40. They'd arrested 2 other sheriffs and a county judge who'd participated in or enabled the abuse. The investigation revealed these men had been coordinating for years, sharing information about which families were vulnerable and which girls could be targeted without significant risk of exposure. They'd used their positions of authority to intimidate victims and their families into silence. The evidence from the original sheriff's house included communications between the men discussing their activities and planning future targeting. Some messages were coded, but others were shockingly explicit about what they were doing. Agent Robbins said the investigation was still ongoing, and they expected to identify more victims as word spread and more people came forward. She urged anyone with information to contact the FBI tip line. She also announced that victim services had been expanded to cover all the newly identified survivors and their families. The press conference made national news again, and our phones started ringing with reporters wanting updates on Anna and how our family was handling these new revelations. Mom stopped answering and let everything go to voicemail. The victim impact panel happened on a Wednesday evening at the county courthouse. It wasn't part of the legal proceedings, just an opportunity for victims who wanted to speak publicly about their experiences. Mom, Anna, Jake and I sat in the audience along with maybe 50 other people, including some reporters and victim advocates. Sarah Klein spoke first, standing at a podium with her hands shaking but her voice steady. She described what the mayor's son did to her at a party 2 years ago, how she woke up confused and scared with no memory of the night before. She talked about finding out later that he'd photographed her while she was unconscious and shown the photos to his friends. Then came the accusation that she'd tried to seduce him, followed by the ceremony in the square where they shaved her head while people she'd known her whole life watched and did nothing. She said the worst part wasn't even the assault or the public humiliation. It was the years of carrying shame that belonged to him, not her. Jessica Murphy went next and told a similar story with different details. Amy Rodriguez spoke last and broke down crying halfway through but kept going. She said she'd tried to kill herself 6 months after her ceremony because she couldn't handle the way people looked at her in town. Her parents had sent her to live with relatives in another state just to keep her alive. Listening to their stories, I understood more clearly how the ceremonies weren't just about punishment. They were about marking the victims permanently, so everyone would remember what happened to girls who didn't stay in line. After the 3 main speakers finished, 2 other women stood up and shared their experiences from years earlier. The room was silent, except for crying. When it ended, Anna walked up to Sarah, Jessica, and Amy. They stood together for a long time, just holding each other. Anna told me afterward she was thinking about speaking publicly herself when she felt ready. Hearing the other women's courage made her realize her voice mattered too, that sharing her story might help someone else find the strength to report their own abuse. The town council meeting about the pink chair happened the following Monday night. The agenda item read formal apology and removal of ceremonial equipment, but everyone knew what it really meant. The council chambers were packed with people on both sides. Kevin Branson started the meeting by arguing that removing the chair was erasing history and giving in to outside pressure. He said the ceremonies were a town tradition that had maintained order for decades, and the current situation was overblown. 2 other council members echoed his points about government overreach and defending the accused men's rights. But the majority of the council had shifted. The new members who'd been elected in a special vote after 3 others resigned spoke about the need to acknowledge harm and begin community healing. They presented a formal motion to remove the chair from the square, issue a public apology to all victims, and create a memorial acknowledging what had been done to women in the community. The vote was 7-3 in favor. Kevin Branson and his 2 allies voted no, but they were outnumbered. The council announced the chair would be removed within 48 hours, and a committee would be formed to design an appropriate memorial. Some people in the audience cheered while others walked out angry. Anna wasn't there, but I texted her the results. She wrote back that it was a small step, but an important one. Removing the chair wouldn't undo what happened to her and the others, but it meant the town was officially acknowledging that what they'd called tradition was actually abuse. The memorial plans included listing the names of all known victims with their permission, creating a permanent record that these women existed and what happened to them mattered. 3 weeks after the memorial committee announced their plans, Anna sat in her regular therapy session with Kathleen Joyce when something changed. She'd been talking about the court proceedings, about the legal strategies, about organizing victim support meetings, all in her usual controlled voice. Then Kathleen asked a simple question about how Anna felt the day after the ceremony, not what she did or what happened next, just how she felt. Anna opened her mouth to give another measured response, but instead her face crumpled and she started crying, not quiet tears, but full-body sobs that shook her shoulders and made her gasp for breath. She cried for 20 minutes straight, while Kathleen sat quietly nearby, occasionally passing her tissues, but mostly just letting Anna release everything she'd been holding inside since that day in the square. When Anna finally stopped, she looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, like she'd been carrying something heavy, and finally set it down. Kathleen called Mom after the session ended and explained this was significant progress. Anna had been functioning in warrior mode since the arrests, staying strong and strategic and controlled because that's what everyone expected from the girl who took down the mayor. But healing required letting herself be vulnerable and human, allowing herself to feel scared and hurt and angry instead of just brave. Mom listened and thanked Kathleen, then went to Anna's room where my sister was lying on her bed staring at the ceiling. Mom didn't say anything about the crying, just sat on the edge of the bed and held Anna's hand until dinner. The state capitol hosted a ceremony 6 weeks later when the legislature passed a new law specifically criminalizing forced head shaving and other public humiliation practices. The bill's official name was generic legal language, but everyone called it the Anna Walton Act, after the case that brought national attention to these abuses. Anna wore a navy dress Mom helped her pick out and stood behind the governor at a podium surrounded by legislators and victim advocates. The signing room was packed with cameras and reporters. The governor spoke about protecting vulnerable citizens from gender-based violence disguised as tradition or discipline. He talked about how one young woman's courage exposed systematic abuse that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Then he turned around and asked Anna to stand next to him while he signed the bill into law. She moved forward, and the cameras flashed as he used multiple pens to sign different parts of his name, handing her one of the pens as a keepsake when he finished. Afterward, the governor shook Anna's hand and thanked her personally for her bravery in exposing what happened in our town. He said her actions would protect countless other girls in communities across the state. Anna smiled and thanked him, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she held the ceremonial pen. A reporter asked Anna how she felt about having a law named after her case, and she gave a short statement about hoping the legislation would prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. We drove home that afternoon with the signed bill and the pen, and Anna put both in a box in her closet because she wasn't ready to display them yet. Jake's return to the school the following Monday came with a formal accommodation plan the counselor had spent 2 weeks developing with his therapist. The plan allowed him to leave any class if he felt triggered or overwhelmed without needing permission or explanation. He just had to take a pass from his desk and go directly to the counselor's office, where someone would always be available to talk. He also had scheduled daily check-ins with the counselor during lunch period to monitor his emotional state and discuss any difficulties. His teachers received training about trauma responses and supporting students with anxiety. Most of them were genuinely supportive and made sure Jake knew he could use his accommodations without judgment. But not everyone was kind. 3 students whose families vocally supported the accused men started making comments in the hallways about Jake being weak and needing special treatment. One boy, whose father worked for the mayor's defense team, told Jake that real men don't cry about seeing discipline happen. Another student, whose uncle was friends with the sheriff, spread rumors that Jake was faking his trauma for attention. The comments happened when teachers weren't around, in bathrooms and stairwells and the parking lot. Jake tried to ignore them, but each cruel remark chipped away at the progress he'd been making in therapy. He started using his accommodation pass 3 or 4 times a day, leaving classes to sit in the counselor's office because being around other students felt unbearable. His grades dropped as he missed instruction time. Kathleen told Mom this was a normal setback and they needed to be patient, while Jake learned to cope with both his trauma and the secondary harm of being targeted for having trauma. The preliminary hearing stretched across 4 days in late November, with both sides presenting evidence and legal arguments. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly yellow. Anna, Sarah, Jessica, and Amy all attended along with several other victims. The prosecution presented the recordings, photographs, witness statements, and trafficking evidence collected by the FBI. Defense attorney Carlson argued procedural issues and tried to suppress certain evidence, but the judge denied most of his motions. On the fourth day, the judge announced his ruling. He stated clearly that the evidence presented demonstrated sufficient grounds for all charges to proceed to trial. The civil rights violations were obvious, the trafficking evidence was substantial, and the conspiracy between the mayor, sheriff, and mayor's son was well documented. Carlson immediately stood and filed motions to dismiss based on cultural practice arguments, claiming the town's correction ceremonies were protected traditional discipline similar to practices in some religious communities. But the judge looked skeptical, even as he accepted the motions for consideration. After the hearing, we met with the prosecution team and several legal experts who'd been observing the proceedings. They all agreed Carlson's cultural practice defense had almost no chance of success, given the clear civil rights violations and the fact that the ceremonies specifically targeted girls while exempting boys from similar discipline. One expert explained that religious freedom and cultural tradition don't protect practices that violate fundamental civil rights, especially when those practices involve minors and lack genuine consent. The trial would move forward. Anna struggled with a decision for 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing ended. The prosecution had her recording from the party and her detailed written statement describing what happened in the square. They didn't technically need her to testify in person, but Anna kept thinking about facing the mayor's son in court, about making him hear her voice directly, instead of just listening to a recording. She talked to Kathleen about it in therapy, discussed it with Mom and me at home, and finally called Sarah to ask what she was planning to do. Sarah said she was testifying because she needed the mayor's son to see her as a real person, not just a victim in a file. That conversation helped Anna make her decision. She called the prosecutor and said she wanted to testify at trial. When I asked her why she'd chosen to put herself through that stress, she explained she needed to look the mayor's son in the eye while she spoke. The recording was powerful, but it was just audio from a party where he'd been drunk and careless. She wanted him to hear her voice now, see her face, understand that she was a person he'd tried to destroy but couldn't break. She wanted him to know she was still here and still fighting while he sat at the defense table facing decades in prison. Mom worried about the emotional toll, but respected Anna's choice. The prosecutor scheduled a preparation meeting for the following week to help Anna get ready for both direct examination and cross-examination. Mom started attending meetings with victim advocates 2 months after the arrests, initially just to get support for our family. But those meetings sparked something in her. She kept thinking about how powerless she'd felt when the mayor threatened her in his office, how she'd tried to protect Anna with money and begging, but had no real options because the men in authority held all the power. She met other mothers at the meetings who'd experienced similar helplessness, women who'd watched their daughters get targeted and couldn't stop it because reporting meant retaliation. Mom started talking to these women about creating a more organized support network, specifically for families affected by gender-based violence in small towns where traditional power structures protected abusers. She reached out to state victim services to learn about resources and funding. She connected with advocacy organizations that worked on similar issues in other regions. Within 6 weeks, she'd helped establish a small support network with regular meetings, a hotline for families needing immediate help, and connections to lawyers willing to take cases pro bono. Her own experience of failing to protect Anna drove her passion for helping other mothers who faced similar threats from men in authority. She couldn't change what happened to our family, but she could try to prevent it from happening to others. The mayor and sheriff both hired expensive defense attorneys who started negotiating for plea deals in early December. They wanted to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for lighter sentences, hoping to avoid the maximum penalties they faced if convicted at trial. But Prosecutor Osborne refused to negotiate their cases separately from the mayor's son's case. He told their attorneys that all 3 men would face trial together, or all 3 would get acceptable plea deals together, no individual deals that would let any of them escape full accountability. Osborne wanted the jury to see the complete picture of how power was abused across multiple institutions, how the mayor used his political authority, how the sheriff used his law enforcement authority, and how the mayor's son used his family connections to victimize girls with impunity. Splitting the cases would weaken that narrative and potentially let 1 or more defendants escape with minimal punishment. The defense attorneys argued this was unfair to their clients who had different levels of culpability, but Osborne held firm. He had strong evidence against all 3 men, and he wasn't interested in letting any of them cut deals to save themselves. The negotiations stalled, and trial preparation continued. Local therapists organized a community healing circle in mid-December, sending invitations to victims, supportive family members, and any town residents who wanted to acknowledge the harm and work toward repair. The event was held at the community center on a cold Saturday afternoon. About 60 people attended, filling the main room with folding chairs arranged in a large circle. Anna sat between Mom and me, with Sarah, Jessica, and Amy nearby. The therapists leading the circle explained the format, emphasizing that this was a space for listening and acknowledging pain, not for debate or defending the accused. Several victims spoke about their experiences, some crying, some angry, all honest about the lasting impact of what happened to them. Family members talked about their guilt and helplessness. Supportive community members expressed regret for not speaking up sooner when they suspected abuse. The families of the accused men didn't attend, nor did their vocal supporters like Kevin Branson and his allies. Their absence was notable and painful, a reminder that the community remained deeply divided, but the 60 people who did attend seemed genuinely committed to healing, even if they didn't always know how. The circle lasted 3 hours and ended with no clear resolution, just a shared acknowledgement that harm had occurred and repair would take time. Anna spoke near the end of the healing circle, her voice steady but softer than usual. She talked about the day in the square, about the months of investigation before that, about her ongoing struggles with nightmares and anxiety. She acknowledged her own anger and fear while expressing hope that the town could eventually move past this division. Her speech wasn't triumphant or inspiring in a dramatic way, just honest and measured. She said she didn't know if the community would ever fully heal, but she hoped people would at least try to listen to each other and acknowledge the pain on all sides. After she finished speaking, several people approached her to apologize for not speaking up sooner when they suspected abuse. An older woman told Anna she'd heard rumors about the mayor's son years ago, but dismissed them as gossip because she couldn't imagine someone from such a prominent family doing those things. A man Anna's father's age said he'd always felt uncomfortable with the correction ceremonies, but never questioned them because that's how things had always been done. Their apologies didn't undo anything, but they mattered to Anna. She thanked each person and accepted their words with grace, even though I could see how exhausted she was by the time we left. The defense team made one final attempt at a plea deal in early January, 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. They offered to have the mayor's son plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 15 years in federal prison and full testimony against his father and the sheriff. The offer was significant because it guaranteed a conviction and substantial prison time while avoiding the uncertainty and trauma of a trial. Prosecutor Osborne brought the offer to all the victims, meeting with them individually and in small groups to discuss the options. Anna struggled with the decision. Part of her wanted to testify and face the mayor's son in open court. Part of her wanted the certainty of knowing he'd go to prison without the risk of an acquittal. Sarah felt similarly torn. Jessica and Amy both said they'd accept the deal if it meant avoiding testimony. After 3 days of painful deliberation, the victims met together and agreed to accept the plea. 15 years wasn't the maximum sentence, but it was guaranteed, and the mayor's son's testimony would strengthen the cases against his father and the sheriff. Osborne called the defense attorneys and accepted the offer. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom felt too cold on the morning of the plea hearing. Anna sat between Mom and me in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, fingers gripping each other so tight her knuckles looked white. Sarah, Jessica, and Amy sat directly behind us with their families. The mayor's son entered through a side door, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked smaller than I remembered, less threatening without his father's power backing him up. His lawyer, Donald Carlson, stood next to him at the defendant's table and shuffled papers while the judge reviewed the plea agreement. The judge asked the mayor's son if he understood the charges and if he was entering his plea voluntarily. He said yes in a flat voice that held no emotion. Then came the allocution, where he had to state in his own words what he did. He read from a prepared statement, describing how he drugged Sarah, Jessica, and Amy at different parties over 2 years. He admitted taking photos while they were unconscious. He acknowledged participating in the forced public humiliation ceremonies for 5 victims, including Anna. His voice stayed clinical and detached, like he was reading a grocery list instead of confessing to destroying lives. He never looked at any of us. He never said he was sorry. When he finished, the judge asked each victim if they accepted the plea. One by one, they said yes, their voices stronger than his had been. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. 15 years in federal prison, guaranteed. Anna's hand found mine as we stood to leave. She squeezed once, hard, then let go. 3 weeks later, the trial for the mayor and sheriff began. The courthouse filled every day with spectators, media crews, and people from surrounding towns who'd heard about the case. Jury selection took 4 days because so many potential jurors already had opinions about what happened. Prosecutor Garrett Osborne opened with a detailed explanation of how the two men abused their authority over 15 years to target vulnerable girls and silence anyone who tried to speak up. The defense attorneys tried to argue their clients were following town traditions and didn't know the extent of what the mayor's son was doing. But then, the mayor's wife took the stand. She testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through boxes of documentation she'd kept hidden in her sister's attic for years. She had journal entries describing conversations where her husband discussed which families to threaten next. She had photos of girls leaving the sheriff's house looking traumatized. She had recordings of phone calls between the mayor and sheriff coordinating their stories when someone tried to report abuse. Her testimony destroyed any claim they didn't know what was happening. Sarah testified next, describing in painful detail what the mayor's son did to her and how the forced ceremony afterward made her feel erased as a person. Jessica and Amy gave similar accounts. The FBI agents presented evidence from the sheriff's house showing a network that transported girls across state lines. Trafficking experts explained how the public humiliation ceremonies were used as tools of control to keep victims silent. The defense tried to suggest the women were lying for attention or money, but Prosecutor Osborne systematically destroyed that argument by showing the pattern of abuse across years and multiple jurisdictions. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, they convicted both men on all federal charges. Anna cried when the verdict was read, not from happiness, but from exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. Sentencing happened 6 weeks after the conviction. The courtroom packed again with victims, their families, and community members. The judge allowed victim impact statements first. Sarah spoke about her nightmares and trust issues. Jessica described dropping out of college because she couldn't function. Amy talked about her suicide attempt 2 years ago. Anna stood at the podium and spoke for 10 minutes about how the ceremony in the square changed her, how she still struggles with anxiety and fear, how she lost her immediate chance at Princeton. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see her shaking. When all the victims finished, the judge addressed the mayor and sheriff directly. He called their actions a betrayal of public trust that warranted severe punishment. He said they'd systematically targeted vulnerable girls and used their authority to silence anyone who tried to help. He sentenced the mayor to 32 years in federal prison. He sentenced the sheriff to 28 years. Both men would be in their 70s before they'd be eligible for release. Anna grabbed my hand again as the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs. This time, she didn't let go until we got outside. Anna spent the next month meeting with different victim advocacy organizations about working with them during her gap year. She decided to focus on speaking at schools about recognizing abuse and finding courage to report it. She told me one night that turning her trauma into education for others helped her process what happened while giving her pain a purpose. She practiced her presentation dozens of times in our living room, refining her message until it felt right. Mom helped her set up a website and social media accounts to coordinate speaking requests. Within 2 weeks, Anna had bookings at 5 different schools across the state. She was nervous about speaking publicly, but also determined to use her experience to protect other girls from going through what she did. 6 months after the arrests, our town started to stabilize into a new normal. The pink chair had been removed from the square and replaced with a small memorial garden that listed the names of all known victims. The town council had 3 new members who ran on reform platforms and won by decent margins. Kevin Branson and his allies lost their seats. The division in our community remained but felt less raw as people processed what happened and figured out where to go from here. Some families who'd supported the accused moved away. Others stayed and slowly began acknowledging the harm that was done. The local paper published a series about the town's history and how the correction ceremonies started decades ago as a way to control women who challenged male authority. Reading that history helped some people understand this wasn't about a few bad men, but about a system that had been broken for generations. Change was happening slowly, imperfectly, but it was happening. Anna cut her hair into a deliberate mohawk style about 7 months after the square. She'd been growing out the shaved strip and hiding it under hats and headbands, but one morning she decided she was done hiding. She went to a salon in the next town and asked them to shave the sides and leave the middle standing up in bright purple spikes. She looked fierce and beautiful and completely herself. She posted photos on social media with the caption, "They tried to mark me with shame, but I'm wearing it as a badge of survival," and received messages from hundreds of women sharing their own stories of surviving abuse and reclaiming their bodies. Some sent photos of their own shaved heads or scars or tattoos, covering marks left by abusers. Anna printed out some of the messages and kept them in a folder labeled Reasons to Keep Going for days when therapy felt too hard. Jake finished 6 months of therapy with Kathleen Joyce and told me he was doing better, though he still had hard days. He'd started a peer support group at the school for students dealing with trauma, meeting twice a week in the counselor's office. 5 other kids joined, all of them processing different kinds of trauma, but finding comfort in sharing their experiences with people who understood. Jake said helping others made him feel less powerless about what he'd been forced to witness. I was proud of how he'd turned his forced witnessing into advocacy for other kids who felt like they had no control. He still had nightmares sometimes and struggled with loud voices, but he was healing in his own way and at his own pace. I watched Anna prepare for her first speaking engagement at a high school 3 towns over, practicing her presentation about recognizing abuse and supporting victims. She stood in front of our bathroom mirror running through her talking points, adjusting her tone, figuring out how to balance honesty about her trauma with hope for change. She was nervous, but determined, and I realized my little sister, who walked into that square with her head high, had become someone who transforms her pain into protection for others. Our family was healing slowly and imperfectly, but we were moving forward together with hope that exposing the truth, despite its costs, made our community and others safer for the next generation of girls.